If we could get the candidates to come to the table, it'd be great because we'd like to get this going so we can get as many questions and information on the table tonight as possible. So if the candidates could come up now, we'd appreciate it.
So they said Dfl, wait, am I in the wrong side?
Is the mayor in the room?
Oh, no.
I haven't seen him tonight.
Yeah. Yep, they have our
Yes. So they said a notebook away is what we're supposed to stay. It's very detailed instructions, which is great. I just met her.
Okay. How are you doing? Good. Perfect.
I know.
Yeah. I don't know what the other cameras are, though. I don't know what the other cameras are.
Oh, we're just waiting for Chris?
I think
We're waiting for Chris.
Is that him? There he is.
Again, I want to remind you, if you need to adjust your mics up or down, now's the time to do that. If the audience could take their seats, we're going to get the show on the road here. My name is Pam Neary, and I'm going to be your moderator this evening, and I'm a proud member of the St. Croix Valley Women's Alliance, who are one of the sponsors for this evening. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank the 5 organizations that put this together and have worked very hard over the last several months to have a successful evening. Wendy Ward, who's from the Marine on St. Croix Indivisible Group, has been our chair. Diane Crater from the Afton Indivisible Group. Wendy Gorski from the St. Croix Valley Women's Alliance. Hank Fisher from Senate District 39 DFL. And Kat Clements from the Stillwater High School Young Dims have all been an integral part of this evening, and I thank them heartily. I'm going to go through quickly the format for the evening. First, I'm going to thank the candidates that are here. In alphabetical order, you'll notice they're seated. Mayor Chris Coleman from St. Paul, Representative Tina Liebling of Rochester, whose name is misspelled due to my error on her sign. We all need to take our German lessons, I guess. And so my apologies to Tina for that. Representative Aaron Murphy of St. Paul, State Auditor Rebecca Otto of May Township, and Representative Paul Thissen of Minneapolis. Unfortunately, Congressman Tim Walz had to be in Washington, D.C. for a markup of the Veterans Bill tonight, but I do want to introduce his running mate, Representative Peggy Flanagan, who is for Lieutenant Governor. A quick explanation of how the evening is in order. It will unfold. First, we're going to have opening remarks by the candidates, 2 minutes each for that. Then we're going to go into the question and answer period. We're going to have one session of longer questions. They'll be given longer answers. They'll be given 90 seconds to answer the questions. We have timers down here. Candidates, the timers will show you a yellow card when there's 30 seconds left and a red card when there's 5 seconds left. If there's no seconds left, a voice will come in your ear and let you know that you should quit talking, because we would like to get our questions in. After the 90-second format of the answers, we're going to go into a rapid response, where each candidate will be given 30 seconds for their response. We're also going to ask the audience. You should have received a postcard by now. You're welcome to write a question on that. After the opening statements, we will be collecting those because we need time to collate them and make sure that we have good questions. And so you should start working on that right away if you're interested in doing it. After the opening statements, I'll ask you to pass them to the end of your row, and they'll be picked up by our volunteers. Candidates, the order of the questions will be starting in alphabetical order and then just rotating down for every question. But we did draw for opening statements and for closing statements, and so the order for those are unbeknownst to anyone except for me. No, but I think the candidates knew that, so we're going to go there. First, just a few rules for the audience. Please turn off the volume of any cell phone that you have. We'd rather not have the questions and answers interrupted by ringing. Also, we'd like you to save your applause, your chants, and any other demonstrations you may be inclined to do until the end of the evening so that we can get to as many questions as possible. Believe me, I'll give you ample time to show your appreciation then. Okay, and with that, I think that we're ready to go. So the order for opening remarks will be Representative Thissen, Mayor Coleman, Representative Murphy, Auditor Otto, and Representative Liebling. So we will start with Representative Thissen. You will have 2 minutes for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you, everybody, first of all, for coming out and joining us. This really does all of our hearts really good to see you here and so many people engaged in this process. And also thanks to the organizers, of course, for pulling this together. It's not an easy thing to do, to pull something like this off, so thank you for that. I'm Paul Thissen. I've been in the legislature for 15 years, served as Chair of Health and Human Services for a couple of those, and then led the DFL in the House for 6 years, including 2 years as Speaker of the House. 2 years that I think were among the most progressive and productive sessions really in a couple generations. And I grew up in Bloomington. I am a suburban kid. My folks were both public school teachers, and they taught me many things, but the fundamental thing they taught me was their example, getting involved in the community, and more importantly, really putting my sister and me ahead of their own interests, making sure that we had the very best start in life. And I think that's a value that all Minnesotans share. Certainly all Minnesota parents share, all Minnesotans share, and I think we have lost that, though, in our state government. This idea that we ought to be paying it forward, that we ought to be thinking about the people down the road, as well as the people right in our own community. And that's what I want to bring back to our state government. The biggest thing in my mind that we need to tackle is basic economic security for Minnesota families. Health care and child care and access to affordable education, retirement security. Those are the things that are keeping people up at night, and we need a state government that is responsive to those issues. And that's what I want to do. That's what I've done in the legislature, and that's what I want to do as the next governor. The thing that I'll say about this race and why I got into it is because we actually have huge challenges, and we need to be bold and authentic in how we're going to approach these issues. We need to be very clear as Democrats what we stand for. But the other thing we need to do is have someone that is willing and has the credibility to go out there and say, I have these bold ideas for what Minnesota can accomplish, but I also have the record of delivering. And to me, the most important test for any politician, the most important thing we should think about in our politics is not what we talk about, but what we actually get done. And I would submit to you that I have a strong record of actually getting stuff done for everyday Minnesotans, and that's what I want to do as your next governor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And the next person will be Mayor Coleman.
Well, thank you, Pam, and thank you to the St. Croix Valley Women's Consortium and the Indivisible Group, and most importantly, the young DFLers that are here and representing the future of our party. I am Chris Coleman. I've been the mayor of the city of St. Paul for the last 12 years. Minnesota needs a governor who is a champion. a progressive champion for the values and the DFL values that have made the state so great over the years. We need a champion for health care for all that's affordable and comprehensive. We need a champion for great schools. We need a championship for equality for everyone in the state of Minnesota. For the last 12 years I've been mayor, and I have led the effort to make sure that St. Paul was an equitable, welcoming community. We stood with our immigrant community to make sure that they knew that they were welcome in the city of St. Paul. We fought on behalf of good schools and quality out-of-school time programs to make sure that all of our children had extended learning opportunities and they were prepared to take their place in a 21st century economy. I fought with other mayors across the United States of America for common sense gun laws that would take guns out of the hands of too many people that were too willing to use them. I fought to make sure that we in the city of St. Paul were an internationally recognized leader on the issues of climate change and environmental sustainability. And I think that we can take the work that we have done together with the community in the city of St. Paul to every city across the state of Minnesota. We can work in every community to make sure that all of our children and all of our families have the resources and the tools that they need to be successful. That's my progressive vision for the state of Minnesota. That's our vision. It's the vision that has been built up over decades by the people that have gone before us. It is up to us to be the champions for those that are voiceless, those that can't fight for themselves. That is what Minnesota has always been about. I want to be the next governor to continue that fight.
Thank you, Mayor Coleman. And our next candidate will be Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Pam Neary, and thank you all very much for being here tonight and for participating in building up our future. I'm Erin Murphy. I'm running for governor, and I want to thank the organizers for pulling this forum together. It's impressive. And I know in the last 24 hours, the planners have dealt with some conflict about whether or not Peggy Flanagan, my colleague, could join us on the stage. And she's here, and I'm glad she's here. And I did post something earlier today saying if the organizers wanted her up on the stage, she should be up on the stage with us. So I just wanted to start there because it's on my mind, and I imagine it's on other people's minds as well. I am running for governor because I believe in a kind of politics that improves people's lives. And when we do that together, when we use that together, we can build a bright future for everybody in the state of Minnesota. I'm a nurse. I chose nursing because I care a lot about people. I'm involved in politics for the very same reason. I cared for people in Marshfield, Wisconsin, and then here at the University of Minnesota, where I was a surgical nurse on the transplant team, and I left the practice of nursing to go to work for the Minnesota Nurses Association. And in 2014, when I was their executive director, my mom, who had strong political views, decided that she was going to participate for the first time in an election because she was frustrated with the war in the Middle East. And at the end of that election, she found out that she had lung cancer. My parents had worked very hard to earn their way. They had earned good health care coverage. And despite that, my mom had to fight very hard to get the care that she needed, and it made me angry, and I ran for office. And for the last 11 years, I have served in the legislature, and I have watched us, Minnesotans, tackle tough issues, and we've lost some of that ambition for our future. And as your governor, I want to bring that back. I believe in us and our capacity to tackle the toughest problems. I'd like to do that with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Murphy. And our next candidate will be Auditor Otto.
Thank you, Pam, and good evening, everybody, and greetings to the mayor, who's in the room tonight, Mayor Kozlowski, and the other dignitaries that are also with us. I'm Rebecca Otto, and I'm really happy to be in Stillwater tonight because I'm really close to home. And it doesn't happen that often. So this is actually where I got my start in politics, and as you know, it can be a bit conservative out here. And together we did extraordinary things together. So I live in May Township. I know there's some other May Township residents here this evening. And I announced in January that I was running for governor. But it started on a school board in Forest Lake, and it moved to state representative, and we won out in this area when Michelle Bachman was in the state senate by 11 points in a special election, when people said it was kind of impossible. But we did it because we focused on our values. And we didn't win re-election when I ran for re-election. However, I did run for state auditor after being urged by Arnie Carlson to do that, who was a 3-term state auditor as well. and we won by the largest margin in 112 years against an incumbent state auditor who happened to be an Anderson. So now I've served as the state auditor now for almost 12 years. I love the work that I get to do on your behalf. We're there to make sure that we have good government in the state of Minnesota, and Minnesotans expect that. We want good, efficient, effective, accountable, transparent government that's responsive to our needs. I'm running for governor because I'm deeply concerned about what I call the politics of unfettered greed. And it's prevalent right now, and it's being fueled by big money, and I want to make sure that we are focusing on the politics of the common good. Because the common good, that's a Minnesota value, and my agenda is all about the common good, and I look forward to sharing that with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least is Representative Liebling, opening statements.
All right, well, thank you. Good evening, everybody. So usually at the end of my speech, I say that TINA stands for There Is No Alternative. But tonight we have an alternative, because it's the other name that's right here, so I'll just put that out there. I'm a state representative, right? Yeah, two of us tonight. I'm a state representative from Rochester. I'm in my 7th term in the Minnesota House of Representatives, but I ran first in 2002, and that was the year, if you recall, that Senator Wellstone's plane went down. I had the extraordinary opportunity to run as a new candidate with Senator Wellstone when he was going around the state, and I was so impressed with him because he would always talk about how the people who had the lobbyists and the lawyers didn't need him. He was there for everybody else. That was something that really impressed me, and I really wanted to model my political career after his. The other thing about Senator Wellstone was that he had political courage. He would do what was right, even if it wasn't popular, and explain it to people, and then they would understand, even if they didn't agree with him. And I wanted to be that kind of a leader as well. So I didn't win that year. A lot of Democrats lost, but now there's a hashtag. It says, nevertheless, she persisted. So I persisted, and I won in 2004, and I was the first Democrat ever elected from Olmsted County. So I turned that red district to blue. So I've always been a bold progressive. I ran as a bold progressive. I was never apologetic about it, and I've run 8 times, and I've won 7 elections as a bold progressive. And I'm running because I think that's what we need now to win, and that's how we need to govern, so that Minnesotans know we are on their side, not on the side of the big shots and the insiders. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, audience, you have about 2 seconds to finish up your questions, and then please pass them to the end of the rows, and we'll have volunteers come down and pick them up as we start the long answer segment. Again, candidates, we will have, I think, about 5 questions, depending on how our time goes, and you will have 90 seconds for each of these answers. We'll start in alphabetical order, so we'll start with Mayor Coleman. On this one, the question is, access to health care was already becoming unattainable for many Minnesotans, and with the latest actions in Washington, D.C., it is becoming even worse. What is your vision for the health care in Minnesota, and what is your plan to get us there?
Well, thank you. Health care is a basic human right. This can't be an option for people, whether or not they have health care, whether or not they can afford to go to a doctor, whether or not they can afford to take their children to make sure that they have the care that they need. Too many of our kids aren't getting the health care that they need. We've seen the horror stories of a child who has an abscessed tooth that gets infected. And because that child couldn't afford $80 or $90 to have that tooth fixed in the first place, hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent in the last months of that child's life trying to save that child in a futile effort to save that child. That's the craziness of the healthcare system that we had. And the Affordable Care Act was a very, very good start in order to make sure that every person in the United States of America had health care. It wasn't a perfect program, but the fact of the matter is we could have gotten there. And the goal was right, to make sure that health care was affordable, comprehensive, and everyone in the United States of America was covered. Minnesota had a relatively good health care system. We continue to be one of the leaders in the nation. But the fact of the matter is we're on a precipice. If the Affordable Care Act continues to be eroded by the current administration in Washington, we will lose billions of dollars in Medicaid coverage in the state of Minnesota. We need to make sure that we're sailing towards, I think, ultimately a single-payer healthcare system. I don't know that we can get there right now because it would require a waiver from the federal government. It would require resources that we don't have. But ultimately, the goal has to be everyone in the state of Minnesota is covered.
Thank you. You can just go right on down the line without me interrupting you.
Okay, well, of course, healthcare is not only a human right, it's also a huge economic issue for families. And I've been supporting single-payer healthcare in the legislature for many, many years and really fighting for it. I think that this is something whose time is coming. But, you know, something that we do as Democrats often is we talk about things and we talk about what we're for, but we're not really clear about it, and then people get confused. And believe me, the Republicans also talk like they're for people, and people get really confused. So one of the reasons I'm running is that I think we have to be very, very clear about what we're for. And single-payer health care, there is a detailed plan for single-payer health care. It's this, the Minnesota Health Plan that Senator John Marty wrote this book, and I've been supporting this for many years. There are a couple things that we need to do immediately. It's a little, the crystal ball's a bit cloudy because of what's going on in Washington right now, and this all impacts Minnesota, but we need to do two things. One is a buy-in to our Minnesota Care program, if the Republicans haven't destroyed it by the time we get there. And the other is to get the HMOs out of our public programs, to deprivatize our public programs. And I have taken on the HMOs, and I will continue to do that because we need them out of our public programs. They are wasting our money. They're making things worse for providers and worse for patients.
People need health care that they can count on, especially when they're sick. And what happened with my family and my mom shouldn't happen to any family in the state of Minnesota, and then when I'm your governor, we're going to make sure that doesn't keep happening to people. I was in Duluth last night. I was there to door knock in the afternoon, and I met with a group of Duluthians, including a group of physicians, and I felt like I was defending my dissertation around my idea of expanding Minnesota Care for everyone in the state of Minnesota. But when I was through that evening's discussion, I think I had some advocates with me who said, you know what, I think we can do that. I believe that we should make Minnesota Care available for everyone in the state of Minnesota, anybody who wants to purchase in. And it's time for us to use our ability to contract directly with providers, as we've done with county-based purchasing already, as we're doing in different models across the state already. Let's use the purchasing power that we have as a state and contract directly with hospitals and clinics and doctors and nurses. In my experience as a nurse and as a policymaker, the best value we're going to get for our healthcare dollars is when it's driven by Minnesotans and with their providers, and not with the health plans in the middle of that. 25 years ago, we passed Minnesota Care and we led the nation. It's time for us to lead the nation again on this question. I'm a single-payer supporter, and I believe that we can lead the nation, and I want to do that as your governor.
My vision for healthcare is that you get a standard set of benefits that, regardless of pre-existing conditions, regardless of age, regardless of employment status, you are covered, period. That you get to choose your provider, which will be a system of coordinated care, and that your providers are going to be incented to keep you healthy, and that we actually reduce costs. So I have a plan, and it's called the Healthy Minnesota Plan. And it provides a clear pathway, it's very detailed, to take where we are today, because our system has been evolving, and get us to a universal, publicly financed, guaranteed, affordable, quality healthcare system, because our future depends on it and lives depend on it. And when I launched my campaign in January, I know it is scary if we didn't get it. I traveled the state starting in January. I launched a listening tour rather than a speaking tour. And what I found is, regardless of where you lived in the state, the same things keep us up at night. Keeping a roof over our head, food on our tables, and clothes on our back, and then our health. And so this is an absolute fundamental. And the ACA didn't really work for the small business community, the sole proprietors, the consultants. And so what we're doing is not sustainable financially, and we must get this done. And we will create a protected fund at the state level. We'll ask for waivers at the federal level, and we will get it done, and we will attract the innovators. Thank you.
Well, to me, I think this really comes down to a pretty basic values question. I'm healthy right now, as many of us I think are, but there's many of us who are also sick out across Minnesota. But we all know that someday we're also going to be sick, and we're going to want someone to be paying a little bit more so that we can take care of our health needs. That means that I should be willing to step up and pay a little bit more today for people who are sick right now. That's what it comes down to me. That tells me that we should move to a Medicare for all, to a single-payer system where we're all in a big pool and we're all in it together. It seems pretty simple and obvious to me. But we can't also forget that it's not just about moving to that insurance reform. We have to get after the cost of health care. And there's things that we can do to make that happen. We can invest in research and development. Minnesota leads the nation in those kinds of things. We can make sure that we are expanding our public health instead of contracting it. You know, we passed the SHIP program in Minnesota about a decade ago. It's making a huge difference in keeping people healthier and bringing down the cost of health care. We have proof that that's the case. But the most exciting thing, and I know Becky Laurie is here tonight, but Tony, her son, traveled around the state this year, and I talked to him just last week, and he said the most exciting thing going on is that there's amazing cooperation going on to help deliver health care more. Right here in Stillwater, the school district and Lakeview Hospital and mental health providers are coming together to provide support to make sure that we're getting the best mental health possible to kids in this community. That's the kind of collaboration we need to see a lot more of. That is what will solve our health care problem long term, and I'm done. So thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Our second question, which will go to Representative Liebling first, is, for many people, climate change is the #1 issue facing humanity. What can Minnesota do to take strong leadership role on fighting climate change?
Well, I'll tell you, one thing I don't think we should do is allow a new oil pipeline to be built across a new section of Minnesota, because I don't think oil is the fuel of the future for exactly this reason. This is a really serious matter. We're seeing it more and more right now. And we need to really be incentivizing clean energy as much as we can. We need to be doing things like helping to improve the climatizing buildings and homes and that kind of thing to help people reduce their energy use. We need to be doing basically everything that we can and using the levers of government when we have them to do that. I think it is absolutely a top issue, and we're seeing it all around us, the impacts of neglecting to do our part. Of course, we can't solve the whole problem here in Minnesota, but we absolutely have to do our best. And I think that it's not only the clean choice, but also better for our economy, creating a lot of jobs, and something that there's just no reason not to move in that direction.
While we watch in Washington, D.C., efforts to pull us out of the climate accord, and all sorts of efforts to repeal a regulation that help us protect both Minnesota and the world's climate, we can make real headway here, and we're seeing it both at the state level and at the local level. And Minnesotans, I think, are leading the way in not only urging that we find solutions on climate, but they're driving that change. And I believe in that kind of politics that takes on those tough issues, and as the governor, we will continue to push forward with work that started when I was a brand new state legislator on the renewable energy standard, and we have watched Minnesota move quickly in that direction, more quickly than we anticipated, and we need to extend that goal, that stretch goal, and watch and push the market in that direction. We are seeing both wind and solar installation happening in big solar gardens and in individual panels in greater Minnesota. Minnesotans are adopting more quickly than we expected, and the market is changing more quickly than we expected. And that's good news for us. It's action on the part of the people. I want to make sure, as we move forward on this, that we are guaranteeing the jobs that people are employing to build the wind and the solar across the state of Minnesota are Minnesota jobs. They're jobs for Minnesotans, and they're labor jobs. That's important as we move forward, and it's missing right now in this equation.
I have a plan for that. It's called the Minnesota Powered Plan, and it is being talked about international. It was written up in The Guardian. It's been being talked about nationally. Bill McKibben has endorsed it, as well as our own beloved meteorologist, Paul Douglas, who's a Republican, because climate change is causing real impacts right now, and there's a moral imperative that we take care of this issue and we go after it aggressively as a state. I've laid out a very clear plan And we will place a price on carbon, and Minnesotans are going to be empowered with a quarterly dividend check, and also you'll be able to access clean energy tax credits that will give you 30% off of different improvements you can make to your home. If you're a renter in an apartment building, we're going to empower landlords to help reduce your utility costs. So it is revenue neutral, it doesn't raise taxes, and it is the right thing to do, and we should be on the cutting edge of the clean energy economy as a state. This is the next generation of good-paying jobs. They tend to be union jobs, and I've got another plan that will work to support this piece as well. All of these different plans I'm going to talk about tonight and I'm speaking about are part of my Renew Minnesota vision. And it's informed by my listening sessions, getting at Minnesotans' hopes and dreams, as well as their concerns and struggles. This is the greatest economic opportunity we've had in a generation. It will generate between 70,000 and 250,000 good-paying jobs and the work can't be outsourced. So that's the kind of agenda I have for Minnesota.
Well, I think you're going to hear a lot of agreement on this issue for all of us up here tonight. Climate change is one of those existential issues that we have to get after. And we can talk about lots of plans and we can talk about the direction we need to go. The good news is that the market is moving in that direction. As Aaron was saying, if you look at what the projections were for the use of solar and wind in 2006 compared to today, much more solar and wind is going on. If you look at the projections for the use of coal in Minnesota, because in 2006 compared to today, much reduced. So we are making progress. What we need to do is keep leading the way and pushing the direction. The thing that I would offer to you is that I've been involved in this issue and actually delivered on these issues for a long time. In 2006 and 2007, when we passed the Renewable Energy Standard, I stood there with Aaron Peterson on the House floor and fought for that to happen. We passed the Solar Standard when I was Speaker of the House. The first time we actually put the price of carbon into the pricing that we did for solar energy. Nation-leading effort that we passed when I was Speaker of the House. I've been there and I've done it. So these are things we have to get after, but what I hope you would consider is the fact that we can't just talk the talk, we have to walk the walk and look who's actually delivered results on these issues.
Thank you. I'm so pleased everybody's paying attention to
Chris
time.
has to go too. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you.
It's going
It's all good. Well, I'm glad I got a chance to answer this question because of all the work that I've done over the last 12 years, there's nothing that I'm prouder of than making St. Paul an internationally recognized leader on the issue of climate change. In December of 2015, I stood with 500 mayors from across the globe on the steps of the Paris City Hall at COP21. And while all the international leaders were out in a tent in the suburbs of Paris talking about what they might do if they could get to an agreement, the mayors were talking under the guise of C40, which is the 40 largest cities in the world. We were talking about the very specific strategies that we were taking to reduce our energy consumption, to reduce our carbon footprint, and to play our role in climate change. And the fact of the matter is, as depressing as it can get when you look at what the current administration in Washington is doing and what the EPA is doing and what they are doing across the board, we have reasons to be encouraged because if cities and states across this country do what they need to do, we can meet our Paris targets. And it's very strategic and very specific steps that we need to take. It is doing a climate inventory, as we've done in the city of St. Paul. We know, for example, that 30% of our carbon footprint comes specifically from the transportation network, transportation system, and now we're going forward to reduce our emissions in that sector. We've retrofitted our buildings. We have a $1 trillion BTU program which allows us to fund retrofitting of private businesses, and they recapture the cost of that retrofitting by the energy savings. We have solar gardens. We have electric charging stations. We can do this, but it's going to require very specific action on the part of cities and states.
Thank you. My apologies for trying to skip you. It didn't work, obviously. Representative Murphy will have the first chance at this question. The influence of money in politics is undermining our democracy. These forces are largely invisible, difficult to trace, and protected by several Supreme Court rulings. Without accepting this status quo as an option, what will you do to influence national and state-level decision makers to reduce the impacts of special interest money in politics?
I love politics and I love campaigning, and I spend most of my time on the ground talking with Minnesotans. It's taken me all over the state of Minnesota. And after the Supreme Court decision around Citizens United, I watched what transformed our elections in Minnesota. and especially in the districts, the hard districts that make up a House majority, I watch sometimes 70 or 80 pieces of mail being delivered into people's mailboxes in the last few weeks of an election. I remember being in Albert Lee, knocking on a door, and there was a garbage can outside of that person's home with all of the mail that had been delivered and cigarette butts. That was their statement about our political communication. And when we are not a part of our politics and we're not a part of our democracy suffers. We have to be a part of it. We have to disclose dark money. We have to work to turn around Citizens United at the federal level. That's got to happen at the Congress. And if they don't, and when they finally do, and until they do, we have to do more here to make sure that our laws are transparent, that dark money is disclosed. When we were in the majority the last time, when Paul was the speaker and I was the majority leader, we tried to pass disclosure laws in campaign finance, and it was the NRA that blocked it. They have too much power. They have too much power, and they stopped that vote here in Minnesota because they want to use that power to influence our democracy. We can't let that happen. We have to stand up against that.
You know, this is why I'm running, because I'm running against what I call the politics of unfettered greed. And the politics of unfettered greed says that all taxes are bad and they must be slashed, that all protections, the protections of our water, protections of our air and our public health, must be repealed, and that all public workers are bad and we must privatize. And the list goes on and on and on, and it's nonsense. The politics of greed simply feeds the bottom line of big industry. There's a place for big industry, but not at the expense of our quality of life. And as a state auditor who works to make sure we have transparency and accountability in government, I'm going to name them, I'm going to call them out, and I'll do it every day if I need to, because right now the scales are tilted. And so they're more tilted towards those that have all the resources and money and all the time. And I think it's like $900 million that kind of the oil industry spends every year to fund these propaganda campaigns. And so it's a very my husband, Sean, who I have to recognize tonight, speaks around the world on this very issue. And it's really the war on science. They don't like evidence-based policy making. They're scrubbing the EPA website of climate change information. So at the end of the day, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push at the federal level to make sure that we're as Aaron said, repealing Citizens United. But the other piece is, at the state level, I'm going to name them, I'm going to call them out, and I will push extraordinarily hard for transparency measures, and I know how to do this, having been the state auditor.
Well, this has transformed Minnesota politics, and particularly at the legislative level, we have seen, as Aaron said, amazing amounts of literature that comes in just to discourage people from voting. So we do need to pass the Disclose Act. We saw the power of that in St. Paul this last week, where people actually knew who was paying for some pretty racist ads, and as a result, those ads kind of went away, and people, and the conversation turned around. That is what disclosure does, and we can pass the Disclose Act in Minnesota and actually make a difference in our campaign laws. But we have to do much more than that, because what this comes down to is a lack of trust. We need to open up all of our government to more transparency. I've been fighting for 3 years on some pretty simple things. Legislators and the public should have at least 24 hours to review a bill that lands on your desk before we vote on it. We should make sure that we have open committee meetings so that the public can weigh in. We should make sure that we don't have these huge bills, but legislators and the public knows that we're voting on the singular issue. That kind of transparency can start to rebuild trust, and I've said, as if I'm the governor, even if I agree with a bill, I'm going to veto that bill if it doesn't follow those basic tenets and common sense principles of transparency, because someone has to lead on this issue. But at the end of the day, the most important thing we have to do, Democrats have to be out there and be clear about what we stand for. That's how we ultimately rebuild trust. That's how we fight back against this powerful money. If we're clear about our values and what we stand for, and we're bold about what we want to accomplish, Minnesotans will respond, and we can beat this back.
Thank you. Paul referenced the incident this last week in the St. Paul mayoral election, and it was absolutely everything that we hate and loathe in politics in this country. It was a racist attack by people that were hiding behind some kind of an entity. It was not transparent, and it was an attack against an African-American candidate for mayor in the city of St. Paul. I stood up with others, we lifted up our voices, and we said, we will not allow this to happen in the city of St. Paul. That is not who we are. That is not what our community is about. And I think that we need to lift up our voices across the state of Minnesota. We need to stand up when we see these vile attacks that are occurring, again, under anonymous source or anonymous organizations, fueled mostly by the Koch brothers, who are trying to buy the entire political system in the United States of America. There's a reason why no Republican in the entire country will stand up on the issue of climate change anymore when John McCain had run on the issue of climate change in 2008. It's because the Koch brothers won't allow you to run on basic common sense issues like climate change. But I cannot believe that the power of the people cannot overcome the power of corporate money. And when we have our voices lifted up, when we stand together, when we work in community like we are doing here tonight, we will overcome the power of that money, because the power of the people is the strongest power that there is.
So you're going to hear a lot of agreement on this issue too, of course. And, so let me mention a couple things that haven't been mentioned. One is we have a pretty good public financing system here for campaigns. I mean, it's a little bit of public financing. I think we should strengthen and expand that so that having money or having wealthy friends is not a requirement for running for office. So ordinary people can get into politics and represent their interests. That would be one thing. Another thing is, I think that we need to be sure that as politicians and as office holders, that we hold ourselves accountable. We need to strengthen our gift ban in Minnesota, which has been eroded. We need to have a law that requires legislators and people in the executive branch to disclose junkets that they go on that are funded by outside interests. Believe it or not, you can have a trip to China funded by some outside interest and never have to disclose it. And it happens all the time, not to China, but, little smaller trips, but that happens all the time. We have to make sure, too, that we hold ourselves accountable so that, for example, we heard recently where some appointees of the governor were kind of misusing the public trust with regard to the stadium. If I was a governor, I would have no tolerance for that. Those people would be out immediately. That's something we have to do, because if we don't, people don't believe that we're really for them, and we lose the public trust. And if we do those kind of things, we don't deserve the public trust. We have to have no tolerance for abusing the public and make sure that we really do act as though public service really is about service.
Thank you. The next question, we'll start with Auditor Otto. This question is, what are the two most pressing issues facing Minnesota, and what will you do about them?
So my agenda is a bread and butter. It's an economic agenda, and I would contend that we do not have a quality of opportunity across our state, which is really important. And in Minnesota, we believe that when someone works 40 hours a week, that they're able to support themselves. And so that's why my whole Renew Minnesota vision is really focused around the economy. I have a small business background. That's where I come from. And so looking for ways government can do this. And then the other big piece is education, making sure that we continue to provide for a strong public education system, because our intellectual capital is one of our greatest assets. And so economic equality or opportunity or quality of opportunity, and then education, although healthcare plays into the economic piece too. So they all interplay with each other. Today I released my 15-5-2 plan, which is another piece to my Renew Minnesota plan. And it's laying out a way to get to $15 an hour for our minimum wage. And it is phased in over 5 years, so that's the 15-5. And for small businesses and communities in greater Minnesota, we'll give them 7 years. The 2 is 2 years free in the MnSCU system. So once our students, our young people graduate from high school, up to 4 years out from high school, they get to go 2 years free at MnSCU. And that's really meaningful, because right now we have employers with really good paying jobs and they can't fill their spots. So we need to train workers of the 21st century jobs. And so to me, those are really important pieces for our state.
Well, the two big issues that I think we need to tackle, the first is economic security of Minnesota families. That is what is keeping people up at night. That's what our party should be about, giving people peace of mind. And what that looks like is pretty simple. It's making sure that we have debt-free college, so people can graduate from college, maybe work a summer job to pay for it. That's where we used to be when I graduated from college. We need to make sure that child care is affordable. The number one issue I hear, well, second after health care, is the lack of accessible child care in the state. Representative Flanagan has done a tremendous job working on that issue in the state of Minnesota, and we need to do a lot more around that. Medicare for all, making sure that people can go to bed at night knowing they can see a doctor or a nurse when they need to. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is children's health care. I carried the Cover All Kids legislation in 2007. We passed that with Governor Pawlenty. That meant staying up late at night, working through all the details to get that done, but tens of thousands of more Minnesota kids can see a doctor or a nurse as a result. Something that's very personal to me because my child, has a congenital condition that needs that kind of help. And retirement security. We need to make sure we get after that. But the other thing we have to get after are the racial disparities we have in this state. We're the second most unequal state in this country, and we can do much better than that. It's a moral issue. It's an economic drag for us. And at the end of the day, it's all of us in this room who need to really confront the power that we hold that is holding other people down. If we don't acknowledge the fact that we hold power that other people are excluded from, we're never going to take this on, and as governor, I want to do that.
Well, the challenge of all, what are your top two issues is, you're running for governor because you want to tackle all of the challenges that we're facing across the state. So when I look and see that we've had 24 straight months of above average temperatures, my number one issue is climate change. When I'm talking with a child in the Frogtown community who is struggling with multi-generations of poverty, closing that achievement gap and closing that economic disparity is my number one issue. When I'm talking with farmers in greater Minnesota, how do we protect the family farm while helping them make sure that they are doing their job to protect the environment and the clean water of the state of Minnesota? The fact of the matter is the governor doesn't have the luxury of saying this issue or that issue. It is economic security. But ultimately it begins, and if there's one issue that I think is the most critical one facing the state of Minnesota, is we're heading towards a fiscal cliff. The tax cuts that the Republicans passed this last year, tax breaks for corporations, tax breaks for billionaires, tax breaks for big tobacco, have ruined the future of the state of Minnesota unless we address this. And everything else that we want to do, whether it's improving the quality of educational outcomes, whether it's improving our business climate, whether it's improving our infrastructure, is simply going to be impossible unless we deal with the fiscal cliff that the state of Minnesota is heading to. And that's before we get to the blinking off of the provider tax that will cost the state of Minnesota billions of dollars. We need to get our fiscal house in order, and then we can dream about what we can do for everyone in the state of Minnesota to provide that economic security that others have talked about.
So as we all go around, we do a lot of these forums, you start to hear each other kind of pick up our language, and we all kind of start to sound the same. But I'm the only one of the 6 candidates who supported Bernie Sanders. And the reason I supported him was not because we're both Jewish or I liked his hairdo. It was because I thought he was talking about the real issues, and he was saying the economy is rigged. And the economy is rigged. It's still rigged. It's like it's rigged against ordinary people who are struggling to get ahead. And a lot of these issues that we're all talking about really are about that. They're about the fact that over a recent 40-year period, the productivity of Americans went up 77%, but the average wage only went up 9%, and CEO salaries went up 950%. So is it any wonder that people are struggling, that students can't get an education? I've been proposing 2 years of free college, because nobody can get ahead anymore with just high school. We ought to absolutely do that. But economic issues and then climate change, absolutely, because everything we do can just be wiped away. We're seeing this. Just look what happened in Puerto Rico. I mean, this is not going to be the end. So we've got to tackle this as soon as we can.
When I'm the governor for the state of Minnesota, my party will be us. It's time for us to put us back in our politics again. I'm married to a guy named Joe Faust, and back in 1980 he started a painting company, and he paints houses all across the metro area, well, mostly in the East Metro area now because of transportation problems. In 2008 and 9, Joe's company was nearly wiped out because of the recession, that great recession that people are still experiencing the impact from. They're still not feeling secure after that. And I am an optimist, but Joe is a pessimist. And when I ask him why he feels so frustrated, he says nobody on Wall Street paid a price for what happened to our company, but we did. Our kids were going to college, and we had saved money for their education, but it didn't go far enough, and they borrowed money, and they have debt, and we borrowed money, and we have debt. That was our job. But Joe is 60, and he's tired of climbing the ladder, and he wants to retire, and he can't. And when I think about the people of Minnesota and the stories that I hear, they're frustrated, and they see a legislature and a government right now that isn't paying much attention, who can't get transportation done or a basic bonding bill done. We have to put ourselves back in our politics, and we together, and I know that we can because I've seen us do it, we can build the future that we deserve in the state of Minnesota. But it's got to be about us again. That's what I'm going to do when I'm your governor.
Thank you. The next question, we'll start with Representative Thissen. It is, affordable housing is simply not available in many parts of Minnesota. What is the state role in ensuring that Minnesotans have an affordable place in which to live?
This is, again, one of the biggest issues I hear from employers, from people that are seeking the housing, from people that lack housing. This is a very significant issue. A couple things that we can do. The first thing is we can actually continue to invest in public housing, much more than we have. When I was Speaker, we passed the first $100 million bonding appropriation for affordable housing, and that should be the bottom line going forward. But the issue is that we're not going to be able to solve this just with public investment. We need the private market to step up. And so there's ways that we can cooperate with the private market to give them the incentives to create inclusionary housing, incentives to allow people to stay in their homes. We need to give renters much more power than we do right now so that they have more leverage with the landlords than they do right now. Too often what's happening is private equity is coming in to our communities, buying up buildings, raising the price of those buildings, forcing communities out and leaving them in the cold. And then no wonder we have a lack of affordable housing. We need to get after that. But at the end of the day, this issue, like so many other issues, comes down to power. And as Democrats, we really need to start calling that out more. We have too much concentration of power in this country, too much concentration of economic and political power. And until we call that out and say that that's not right, and we give the power back to people that are doing the work of actually building this state, we're not going to solve this issue or any of the other issues that we've been talking about tonight.
Paul's really hitting on something. I think that it is important for us to understand that all the challenges that we're facing with regards to funding for education, for infrastructure, for housing, are in the context of an economic system that is out of control and out of whack. And it has continued to be exacerbated, the divide between have and have not. And so we're trying to fix a problem within an existing system that makes it very difficult to do that. But affordable housing is one of those pieces that, as mayor of the city of St. Paul, I've had to deal with head on. And even going back to the time that I was on the city council, we passed one of the most comprehensive affordable housing policies in the entire country. We said that any project that there was public participation in had to include 20% of the units had to be affordable for people at 30% and 50% of area and median income. And that is a policy that has provided housing opportunities for all. But the challenge and the weird thing, you know, this is freakonomics, I guess, when the economy is doing well, we're seeing more people on the streets of our cities across the state of Minnesota because they're getting priced out of housing. The economy is strong, housing prices are going up, their incomes aren't going up, and so all of a sudden the housing unit that used to be affordable is no longer. We need to go across the state of Minnesota, make sure all of our communities have workforce housing, affordable housing for all. It's costing our economy. When Polaris went to expand, the reason they didn't expand in the state of Minnesota, one of the reasons was because they didn't have the housing stock up in Roseau in order to be able to provide for their workers. This is a huge challenge across the state that we need to tackle head on.
So there are many ways that the state can be involved in producing more affordable housing, but the bottom line reason that housing isn't affordable is because wages are too low. So if we raise wages, then housing or more housing will be affordable. And if there's a demand for housing because people have money to spend on housing, then more housing will be built. So I brought with me this report from DEED, something called the Minnesota Cost of Living Study, and they do this every year. It's very interesting. You can find it online. And what it's giving an estimate of what it would take for a family consisting of two parents and a child with 60 hours of work time to what they need to have what's known as a basic budget. So this is not the poverty level. This is just to have a basic, reasonable budget. And it's actually pretty eye-opening. So statewide, just averaged across the state, you need $17.69 an hour for both wage earners working their 60 hours to just have a basic budget that satisfies that family. Well, we're not anywhere near there. Of course, it varies by region. But this just shows that this is really the basis of our problem. Lots and lots of us are living without adequate incomes, and this is not getting a lot better.
The basic building blocks for our communities, a good education, a good job, good health care, and a safe place to live. And if you don't have a safe place to live, it's hard to learn. I remember when my kids were in school in St. Paul at Expo Elementary, there was a little girl that kept coming in and out of her class because she was homeless. And she fell behind, and you could expect that that was going to happen to her. It's hard to work and hold a job if you don't have a safe place to sleep at night, and so you don't sleep. It's hard to keep a job. There are a lot of people that are experiencing homelessness right now who work for a living, but they don't have access to a safe place to live. And it is really hard to heal, to be healthy, if you don't have a safe place to live. The data shows that. I think we know what we need to do. We know how to invest in housing. We have been making steady investments in housing, and we have a housing shortage in the metro area, and we have a housing shortage in greater Minnesota as well. We have to continue to pursue those investments, working with the private marketplace. That's important. But we have to recognize those basic building blocks that are important to families and communities: a good job, health care, education, and housing. And we've got a housing crisis in Minnesota right now. We've got to solve it.
Okay, thank you. That concludes our long answer segment. We're now going to go into a rapid response. You will have 30 seconds for this. These are easier questions. Our timers will show red at the end of 25 seconds, so you'd still have 5 seconds left. We will start this with Mayor Coleman, I believe, right? Is that right?
I did 15 seconds.
Yes. The question is, do you favor stricter gun control? And if so, what steps will you take?
Absolutely, I favor that. They're common sense gun laws. That's what we need. 90% of Minnesotans support the idea of universal background checks. And in communities and in states where you've had universal background checks, you've seen a 60% drop-off in gun violence, particularly suicide by gun. I have been a leader with other mayors across the country. If you went to the Mayors Against Gun Violence website, I'm on the front page of that site because of my leadership on that issue. This is not about taking guns away from hunters. It's about getting them out of the hands of criminals.
Pam, I did miss the last question.
Oh, I'm good at skipping, aren't I? I'm sorry.
I apologize. I don't mean to break the flow.
No,
But
that's good.
I can be
Break
very
the
brief.
flow. Yeah,
I did
you're right.
miss
You're
it.
right.
Yes.
You're right. Affordable housing. I was on the wrong question.
I'll be very brief.
Can you do a combined answer affordable gun control policy?
Maybe you
No.
could tie those two together sometime.
No.
I'll just let me repeat the question so
Yep. No, I
people,
got it.
so
Affordable
people know
housing.
what it is.
Yeah.
It's affordable housing is simply not available in many parts of Minnesota. What is the state role in ensuring that Minnesotans have an affordable place in which to live?
I serve on the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency Board, and I've had the honor of doing that for 11 years, and we issue tax-exempt bonds, and we are there to make sure that we are part of the we help finance safe, clean, affordable housing in the state of Minnesota. Our job is to focus on our lowest income Minnesotans as well as our middle income Minnesotans. And the legislature plays a part in this in terms of sometimes they do special appropriations. A lot of this work happens at the local level, so projects have to come to us. We have criteria that we filter with it. The thing is right now, we have a great need. Over half of Minnesotans right now are cost burden, are renters. So that means they're spending more than a third of their income on housing, and the rental market's very tight. The housing market is becoming tighter too. So it is an issue. The legislature has specifically created a program for workforce housing. We're getting that built, but it takes local governments, private developers, nonprofits, our resources, federal resources. It's an extraordinary pool of resources that make affordable housing happen. But right now we are resource poor for one of the second times since I've been on the board. The downturn had happened as well. So, and another big issue we have to be focused on is senior housing. We don't have enough affordable senior housing, so we're going to work to help our fellow Minnesotans for the next 20 years age in place while we build up this housing stock. So we've got a lot of work to do, and as governor, I plan on continuing to make sure Minnesota Housing Finance Agency is the strongest agency in the nation, which it is.
Thank you. Continue to correct me, you guys. I'm clearly not in sync with my list here. I'm going to just repeat the short answer question again so that Representative Liebling can start with this, and we'll go to the end of the table on this. Do you favor stricter gun control? If so, what steps would you take?
I do favor stricter gun safety measures, and starting for sure with universal background checks. That's just the low-hanging fruit. And looking at any other policies that are suggested, because sometimes we are held to the standard in gun issues. For some reason, people want to say, well, if it won't solve the entire problem, then we can't do it. Bananas. We are going to do it, and it doesn't have to solve the entire problem.
I support efforts to reduce gun violence prevention, and we should do that in Minnesota. Our politics on this front is broken, and I've watched members of our caucus and members elected to represent the interests of people be stymied by the voice, the outsized voice of the National Rifle Association. And people sometimes say to me, in our politics, you can't say those words anymore. I think it is important for us to recognize their outsized reach, and until we slow them down and put Minnesotans back in this discussion again, we're not going to make the headway we need to on universal background checks and reducing violence prevention.
I was just on the radio about this. I strongly support having the CDC study this as a public health issue, just like they studied motor vehicle deaths. And you know what? When we started studying them, we ended up changing the design of cars, headrests, seat belts, steering wheels that collapsed. Well, not collapsed, but they were more flexible. We changed the design of our roads. We created signs that, broke away. We know how to do this, and frankly, it's outrageous that the Dickey Amendment's in place. We must, and then once we have the evidence and the data, then we can make informed decisions. And we didn't take everyone's cars away, right? And we have education campaigns. We decided drinking and driving wasn't a good idea. We decided that texting and driving wasn't a good idea. We know how to do this. I will be strongly vocal, and I've been talking with...
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
That's your time. Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, I too support common sense gun laws, and we absolutely need to do it. Where we need to focus, I think, most of all is on suicide and domestic violence. That's where we know we can make the biggest difference if we talk about those issues, and people's lives can be saved, and that's what it comes down to. But it also comes down to standing up to the National Rifle Association and these special interests that are pushing down on us. After those dozens of kids were killed in Newtown, the fact that people will continue to take money from the National Rifle Association is outrageous. And we should not allow that, and we should just say that is simply unacceptable.
Thank you. Representative Liebling, you will start, and somebody remind me that we'll end with Mayor Coleman here. Do you support adding oil pipelines across Minnesota? And kind of as a corollary, what's the best way to protect Minnesota's waters?
All in 30
seconds?
Go.
Go. Well, I already answered the pipeline question.
Okay, go.
We've got the water issue is multifaceted. Everything from what people put on their lawns in the city to what farmers are putting on their fields in the countryside. We've all got to take responsibility for having clean water.
I am not opposed to pipelines, though I am opposed to Line 3, where it's sited right now. It goes through ceded tribal land, and I'm opposed to that. People across the state of Minnesota are concerned about the strategic asset of our water. It's something we value, and with that common basic value, something that we share together, we will find our way forward to make sure that we're protecting the strategic asset of our water across the state of Minnesota while we protect the jobs that are important to us as well.
Oil pipelines do not belong in water-sensitive areas. They don't belong on tribal lands, and we need to respect treaties.
Well, I don't oppose pipelines per se in Minnesota. I think that we need to transition to a carbon-free economy, but we're not going to do that overnight, and we need to be realistic about that. We also do need to protect our water, and I think the bottom line here is this is something that all Minnesotans agree on. We agree that our waters are our quality of life. We understand that it's a key to our economic future. If you look at Arizona and California, the drought they're seeing, our water is our economic advantage in this world, and we need to protect it.
The fact of the matter is we have pipelines that are many decades old that are currently leaking and polluting our water system. The replacement of some of those pipelines is the most important thing that we can do to protect our waterways as we do transition, as Paul said, to a carbon-free economy. This isn't an either-or. This is working with tribal governments. This is working with communities. This is making sure we're doing right. But having leaking pipelines in the ground right now that are polluting our waters is not a solution for the state of Minnesota.
Okay, thank you. Representative Murphy, this one you start. What will you do to ensure college affordability?
Boy, college is really expensive right now, and it's expensive because we have shifted the burden to colleges and universities, and they have now shifted that burden in terms of tuition, and I know because we're paying for it in my family right now. So the state budget has got to absorb some of that cost. We have to continue to drive our colleges and universities to be as efficient and effective as possible so that they're using the dollars that they're getting for education. And we need to work to reduce college debt.
College affordability, my 1552, so the 2-year free and MnSCU systems, we must recommit to the common good in Minnesota and invest in our people and provide for equality of opportunity. The University of Minnesota, the legislature has not maintained their commitment to it. Healthcare costs are frankly eating into our budget. That's why my Healthy Minnesota plan is extraordinarily important. We must get the cost down, and that allows us to invest back in our higher education institutions.
Well, the state needs to invest more money in higher education. There's no question about that. That's a part of the solution. We need to make sure that people are starting to get credit for their remedial classes that they're not getting credit for now, that just extends and that they have to pay for. We should make sure that we are setting limits on the debt that people have to repay. We should say that you can only have to pay a certain percentage of your income to repay your college debt, and the state will pick up the difference. The bottom line is we have to get back to the value proposition that college education is not just a private good, but it's a public good that benefits us all, and if we start there, we can solve this issue.
First, expand post-secondary enrollment options. Kids can eliminate 2 years of college by post-secondary enrollment options in high school. That's an incredibly important pathway. Second of all, we need to make sure that our kids are graduating from high school prepared to learn so they don't have to take remedial classes and pay for them when they get to college. Third, loan forgiveness, making sure that if a person coming out of college is working in the public sector, working for a government, working for a nonprofit agency, they can have their loans forgiven. There's a few more points that I'd like to make, but time's up.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so both of my parents went to Brooklyn College, and it was free. We should be, higher ed is a public good, as Paul said, and we should be providing that, but I have had a plan for 2 years in Minnesota because I think it's really doable. 2 years of free college or vocational education after high school. That would be the biggest economic boost we could give this state, and it would help those students. We also need to tackle loan forgiveness, increase our program.
Thank you. Auditor Otto, you'll begin this one. We have witnessed a continuing and widening divide in how minorities are treated by many police forces. What would you do to ensure that all citizens are treated respectfully and fairly by police departments across Minnesota?
We need to first talk about this. We have an opportunity right now because of some of the tragic deaths that we have seen, and all Minnesotans should feel safe in their community. I also work with law enforcement. I'm on the para board, and we have sometimes some of our police and fire are members of this public pension plan, and we've seen disability appeals. They do very dangerous work to keep us safe. But really, it's around training practices. We need to make sure we're doing community policing, that we have these tough conversations, and I'm ready and willing to do that.
We need to train. We need to do much more training so that people understand what the issues are. We need to get mental health involved much more in the discussion that we have around this. We need to change the standard we have in Minnesota for the use of force, which is a very liberal standard and very hard to enforce. And we need to understand that people like me shouldn't be making these decisions, only people like me. Because I don't fear for my safety when I go around, but there's a lot of people that do, and their voices need to be part of this discussion. If they're not, we're not going to solve the problem.
First of all, our officers have to have extensive de-escalation training so that when they get into a situation, they're not immediately turning to force as their first response. They need to have racial bias training. They need to understand the communities that they're policing, and they need to build those relationships in time of calm. You cannot do that. You cannot build those relationships during a time of crisis. People need to know their community. The St. Paul Police Department has been a leader in this conversation, and they have been demonstrating through their training practices and their community practices how we can actually build community and deal with some of these challenges that we're facing in policing.
So we need to change the law and work on changing the culture in police forces so that the first obligation is to defend life. Then if there's racial bias, at least somebody doesn't end up dead. The other thing is we need more women in police forces. That would help to change that culture and I think would reduce the problem considerably.
The shooting of Philando Castile didn't happen far from my home, and the protest the next day happened outside of the governor's residence, which is just a few blocks from where I live. And I watched Minnesotans grieve and express deep anger over that shooting. We do need to change that use of deadly force standard. We do need to invest in de-escalation training and training for our law enforcement officers, and we have to make sure there's adequate LGA funding to make sure that that happens. But let's also recognize in the state of Minnesota that we are dealing with bias within ourselves, and there is structural racism, and we have to find our way together around that issue, not driving people apart, but bringing them together so we can change hearts and minds and change that basic foundation so that everybody's got an opportunity here in the state of Minnesota.
Okay, we have one more rapid response question, and this one we'll start with Representative Thissen, and it is, what is your view of sanctuary cities, and what is the role of the state with respect to them?
I support sanctuary cities. I have voted against the state imposing penalties on sanctuary cities. We need to stand. I represent as a lawyer refugees coming seeking asylum in the state of Minnesota in my pro bono aspect, and I know that the challenges that people are going through. I also think we have to understand that when people are coming here, it's to live up to the best of what this country and people are about, and we should live up to that ourselves as well. And that's how I view this issue.
Can I just say, with all respect, the last two questions are incredibly important conversations that we need to have that 30 seconds cannot do justice to. And I wish I had more time to do that, because how we treat our immigrant community is one of the most fundamental questions about who we are as a state, who we are as a society. We are a state of immigrants, and when we stand strong on behalf of all of our immigrants, whether they're coming from East Africa, from Syria, from Southeast Asia, from South America, we are at our absolute best. And I think that I am proud that St. Paul has a separation ordinance that says you do not ask about the immigration status of a person unless it's absolutely relevant and necessary to law enforcement. That is not about sanctuary cities. That is a term that the Republicans are using to kind of create this divide in our community. We're talking about standing for our immigrants.
I'm sorry to interrupt, because I believe it is a very important question too. I do want to remind the audience that at the end of this there will be about a half an hour at the candidates' tables that you can get more information about the candidates and maybe continue some of the conversations.
Okay. And my turn on this one, right? Okay, so I'm glad that Mayor Coleman said that, because that term sanctuary city is really not the right term. We need to talk about separation ordinances, and I support that, because our police officers should not be doing the work of immigration authorities, and we need to, and that just erodes all of our safety when people who live among us don't feel safe to go to the police to report a crime. That's what this is really about. We need to support our immigrant communities. I agree with that for sure.
And I don't need to use a full 30 seconds to say I agree with that as well.
I believe in local control, number one. So cities should be able to do what they do because there are elections. ICE needs to do their own work. We don't need to assist ICE. That's their job, and they're paid to do that. And I also would not support penalties. There were some bills last session that would have penalized local government and take away LGA and some different important resources, and I wouldn't support that either.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move to our last segment of questions. These are questions that have been gathered from the audience, and Adam Johnson, who is the co-chair of the Stillwater High School Young Dems, will be asking these questions, and I'm pleased to bring him up here now. These questions will have a 60-second response. Again, the timers are only going to show the red when there's 5 seconds left rather than the yellow also. And I'm going to let Adam take over, and we're going to start, if I'm right, Mayor Coleman starts this one. Am I right, candidates? Yes, okay. So you can start right there.
Sounds right.
All right, Mayor Coleman.
You need to. You're going to have to get a lot taller than you, shorter than you are. There you go. I don't know what to say. Maybe you should sit. There you go.
There we go.
We got it. All right, Mayor Coleman. The buffer strip law has received some pushback. What do you propose to address the problems associated with farm runoff?
Well, I think that I know that I've never talked to a farmer that doesn't care about clean water. And the fact of the matter is most of the lands that are required to have buffer strips are now in compliance with that. But the fact of the matter is the biggest challenge that I heard from farmers is the plan for the buffer strips was announced at a completely a forum that had something to do with pheasants and nothing to do with farmers and with water. And so they were frustrated. They were frustrated with how that was rolled out. They were frustrated with the conversation that was had. If we're going to solve some of the challenges that we face, whether it's relative to clean water, relative to education, relative to transportation, any of these things, we've got to sit down and actually talk with the people that are impacted by these decisions. When we just impose rules on people, of course we're going to get pushback on that. It's not because they don't share our goals, it's because they didn't share the strategy that led to the creation of that goal. The fact of the matter is we're making progress. The farmers, if we increase the use of the agricultural extension to help farmers engage in best practices, we can go a lot further than just imposing rules without any discussion.
Could you repeat the question? I'm not sure I heard it exactly.
Okay. The buffer strip law has received some pushback. What do you propose to address the problems associated with farm runoff?
With farm runoff?
Runoff, yes.
Okay, yeah. So I pretty much what Mayor Coleman said, I mean, I agree with that. You know, I think sometimes the Republicans have done a pretty good job of trying to say there's a big split between urban and rural. And I think that that's more of a creation of theirs because everybody cares about clean water. I agree, farmers care about clean water, and we shouldn't think about rural areas as being all one thing either, because if a farmer is dumping a lot of stuff on their land or they're getting a lot of runoff from their land, there are people who live in the towns around them who care very much about the water that they're using being polluted. So, but I think the buffer law now has been pretty successful. And I think that we have to go forward with the idea that everybody cares about water. There's not a single person who can get by without clean water.
I grew up in a community that was surrounded by corn and beans and farms, and FFA was really popular in our school, and so we learned a lot about conservation as I was growing up. And conservation, the buffer strip is an example of a conservation method, and we can do more than that. At the University of Minnesota, they are already working on perennials, forever green, on cover crops that will and can help us retain the soil. That's important to us. We have gone, especially because of corporate farming, much in a direction of just corn and beans, and we need to reclaim some of the perennials that'll hold the soil on the land and keep it from running off. And I think if we invest in that and pair it with Minnesotans' affection, their support for, their love for water, we can find a path forward on this issue.
It was an implementation issue. I serve on the Rural Finance Authority Board, and I have for almost 12 years, where we finance farm operations, we do farm tours, we talk to the feds about the farm economy, and the winter cover crops are the greatest promise that we have. It's the fastest way for us to get at the runoff. The University of Minnesota has been doing a lot of research. I've been out to the research station, and they're doing it in Iowa right now. I just met with a corn farmer. They had a concern around that they might increase pathogens in the soil, and I'm actually going to look at the research just to get a handle on it myself. But really, as a governor, you have to have regular conversations. I'm a very collaborative person. This is what I do. I know people around the state already. I've been serving for almost 12 years, and so when you want to get something done, you have to make sure that you have checked in with the stakeholders. And I do know also that there's an alternative to the buffer strips. If you work through Department of Agriculture, they can assess your land, and they can. And so I got to tour a farm that actually was doing some alternative approaches to keeping our water clean and reducing pollution runoff.
Well, I was just out in Northfield yesterday, meeting with a farmer named Bruce Peterson, who took me around the land that he farms. And one of the big things we were talking about, and he was showing me, is how he dealt with these alternative practices to make sure that his public waters were kept clean. And they've made a significant investment in making sure that that happens. The bottom line on this, like so many other issues, is I think one of the things we really need to do in the next administration is turn state government really on its head. Too often state government kind of lays down the law, issues a one-size-fits-all regulation, and it's not just in agriculture, it's in lots and lots of things. Instead, what we ought to do is like we did with the broadband rule. We ought to provide resources, we ought to set an expectation and some accountability measures, but let local communities come up with the best plan that suits their needs. What that does is come up with better public policy, I believe, first of all, because there is variation across the state, but it also starts to empower people again. And the thing that I'm most scared of in this state and in this country right now is that people feel that they don't have power over their own lives, and we need to get back to that.
All right, thank you. The next question, starting with you, Representative Liebling. Education funding today is at the same level as in 2003 when inflation is accounted for. How are we going to renew support to help every child realize their potential?
I'm sorry, I'm just having, it must be the mic, it's really hard to, it's just a little fuzzy. Could you just repeat it? Probably the audience heard, but I couldn't quite.
Education funding today is at the same level as in 2003 when inflation is accounted for. How are we going to renew support to help every child realize their potential?
Okay, education funding. So I don't know how many people are aware, but the way we do our state budgeting is pretty much guaranteed to hurt our schools because we don't count inflation. When we say, oh, we've got a budget surplus, that doesn't count the fact that inflation is going to exist, that it exists, that the schools have to pay more for health care, they have to pay more for heat, and all of those things. And so it gives us a skewed picture and makes it very easy to say, oh, let's just do tax cuts with our budget surplus. This is shorting the schools year after year after year because we congratulate ourselves and we just let them keep up with inflation. This is one thing that really has to end. Our schools are just too important. I brought with me my copy of the Minnesota Constitution because it has in it the language about our schools. It's right in our Constitution. I won't read it to you as part of my 60 seconds, which are over, but here it is if you want to see it after.
I am sure you do, and Minnesotans across the state continue to express their strong support for strong public schools across the state, and we are behind in terms of funding. And funding our schools has become a frequent leverage point by the legislature, and that has got an end. As the governor for the state of Minnesota, I will continue the work that I have been doing to make sure that we have got strong public schools, strong public school teachers who are doing awesome work in our schools, and to continue to invest in early learning in pre-K, to make sure that our kids are coming to school ready to learn. If we want to build an economy of our future, if we want to build a bright future for everybody in the state of Minnesota, it has to include strong funding for our public schools. We've fallen behind. That's not the Minnesota way.
So I got into public office because of this very issue, and your zip code should not determine the quality of your education, like period. And I chaired a levy referendum for the Forest Lake schools, and they're really difficult to get across when you're living in a property-poor district, which Forest Lake is considered. Bloomington is a property, wealthy or property-rich community, so it's really hard for communities that don't have that business base to get the levies passed. And I haven't been in the legislature, but as governor, I will make it a top priority because our intellectual capital is one of our greatest assets, as I already stated, and we don't want to squander our children's future. And my Healthy Minnesota plan, which will get at universal single-payer health care, will also reduce costs. And imagine this, most of our costs in our schools and even in government are people. It's salaries and benefits. And if we can get at health care costs in a meaningful way and make sure everyone's covered, we can then reinvest the money back in the schools. We have to have a sense of urgency to get at this issue because our future depends on it.
Well, for me, this issue was summed up by a woman I met up in Mora, Minnesota last spring. Who came up and had tears in her eyes and she said, listen, I have 2 kids in high school and they've raised the fees to participate in activities and I'm going to have to choose which of my kids can participate in that activity because I can't afford both. No Minnesota parent should be in that situation, and that's the kind of values that we need to talk to Minnesotans about as we want to move this forward. And the reason I know that we can do this is because when I was Speaker of the House, we faced a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit. We owed $2 billion to our schools, if people remember that. We paid that back, we balanced the budget, we put our fiscal house in order, and we invested for the first time in early childhood education in a meaningful way. We passed all-day kindergarten, we froze college tuitions. We can do this if we have the leadership that's willing to stand up and say, this is what we ought to do, and then roll up their sleeves and get it done, and that's the kind of governor I want to be for you.
If you've never been to the Hibbing High School, you should go there for 2 reasons. First of all, Bob Dylan played his first gig on stage at Hibbing High School, and it's pretty cool to be there. But second of all, that was a time when Minnesota not only said education was the most important thing that we could do, it actually put its money where its mouth is. And now we have incredible disparities across the state of Minnesota. There are some schools that look like private college campuses with the finest of everything, and there are other schools where kids are walking into where there's not even heat and where the roofs are leaking. You cannot say that a child across the state of Minnesota should have that level of disparity in the outcome and in just the basic quality of services. It's time for a new Minnesota miracle. We led the way in the early 70s on refinancing education. It's not because we're not putting a lot of money into it. 40% of the state budget goes to K-12 education, but it is about making sure that we equalize education across the state of Minnesota and that every child has the education that they deserve.
Thank you. The next question is going for Representative Murphy. How can we expand broadband internet to all Minnesotans quickly?
We all know why broadband's important. It connects us together as people. We need it in healthcare and commerce and education, but really to connect people together. And we need a little bit more of that in Minnesota. Every time I go through an election cycle, I hear people promising that we're going to do it, and then we don't. We made a huge step in 2013 and 14 when I was the majority leader in the House on broadband, and since then we have limped along. And we've made it harder for communities to actually access that money and do the work that they need to do. We need to fund it.
So this is much like the electrification of America. This is the leveling the playing field. We live in a global economy, and I met a businessman in Cannon Falls, very humble man, but he has this big international business, and he said to me, Rebecca, he said, UPS can find me, they can bring their trucks here, they pick up my product. He said, but if I have to do anything with big, large files, I've got to put it on a thumb drive and mail it out. He said, that's embarrassing. And if we want to reinvest and I know it's bad, isn't it? If we want to really level the playing field economically as a state, we've got to figure this out. Now, here's the thing. We have this task force. We've been building it out. We're getting federal funds. We've allocated some state funds. Someone said we have about $3 billion left to go. It's an investment. But at the end of the day, some people say, we've got it out here and I can't afford it. So when you can't afford it, you can't be connected. Being connected is extraordinarily important for our schools, our K-12, higher ed, economy. So I'm going to be focusing on biomanufacturing, bioeconomy, drawing businesses, and then making these investments to make sure that we've leveled the playing field.
Well, this is a critical issue for lots of parts of Minnesota, and in 2014, it was the Minnesota House that pushed through the money that made this happen, the broadband grant program, and we are making a difference. It's going to take more money to do this. Remoteness costs more money, and if we want all of Minnesota to thrive, we need to be willing to make those kinds of investments. It also means pushing back against special interests, which have really deformed the law so that they have veto power over projects. We need to get rid of that part of it. But to me, at the end of the day, what this comes down to is what a woman told me in Wilmer when we were having a discussion around broadband. And she said, I live in Wilmer and I actually have high-speed internet, but my neighbors 10 miles down the road don't have it. What that means is not only are they worse off, but I'm worse off because I can't connect with them. This is all about connecting Minnesotans together, whether it's broadband or many of the issues we're talking tonight. I think that what she said is really what our politics has to get back to. We need to be willing to make the investments for other people because it makes all of our lives better.
The challenge is that broadband and cable access have historically been negotiated community by community. And so St. Paul has a contract, and Minneapolis has a contract, Washington County will have a contract. And so there's a huge incentive for a private corporation to come in and provide broadband access if you have 100,000 potential customers in the city of St. Paul. But when you have a house every mile in greater Minnesota, the incentive, financial incentive, is taken away. But if we view this as one state, and we view that any private-public partnership that we would form has to deal with the issues of concentrated areas of population with less concentrated areas of population, I think we can form that public-private partnership in order to get this thing done. If we make sure that as we're negotiating a contract in the city of St. Paul or in Hennepin County, that we're making sure that that contractor also ultimately has a responsibility to provide in areas that don't have the level of service, I think it's one way that we can accelerate the development of broadband across the state.
So this is an infrastructure issue, no less than roads and bridges. We've got to have it everywhere across the state. And the only thing that I would say to really add or maybe differ a little bit from what's been said is that I really think that because this is infrastructure, it should be publicly owned. The backbone of it should be publicly owned. And then you can bring in the private sector and they can bid and have contracts with different municipalities and so on using the fiber network that is owned by the public. Because I think that's the only way we're ever going to get control of this and bring prices down.
Thank you. Auditor Otto, this one's for you. Do you support Senator Marty's single-payer health care plan? If not, why not?
It's much like Medicare for All, and my Healthy Minnesota plan is Medicare for All on steroids. It's better because what we do is we actually get at reducing costs and controlling costs as well as incenting the systems and providers to keep you healthy, and we put the provider and the patient back in the center of healthcare. And Senator Marty's plan is a fee-for-service. We're going to move away from fee-for-service where you're paying for them to treat a symptom, and we're going to have them focus on whole health, and we're going to move to an upfront quarterly reimbursement, which I've been told will be extraordinarily helpful because it's going to help them innovate, the providers innovate, and focus back on your health. We're going to get rid of administrative burdens. We're going to get rid of this really fragmented system that's partially responsible for the opioid epidemic, and that creates all these extra costs. So there is a better way, and no one gets to tell me it's too hard. It's not too hard. It is simple. We must do it, and there's going to be great gains for us by accomplishing it.
Well, I'm a co-author on the House version of Senator Marty's bill, and I do support Medicare for All, and that's the way we need to. One of the things I really like about Senator Marty's bill is he includes long-term care as part of our health care system. So it's not just the basic care that people get, but the long-term care that they need as people age or if people have disabilities. I think integrating those two things is a really, really important part of his plan that makes sense. The thing that I think we need to do beyond what Senator Marty is talking about is provider delivery reform. We need to continue to challenge our providers to provide care in the most coordinated, comprehensive way possible. And if we don't do that, we're still not going to get at these rising costs that are really going to ultimately bankrupt our healthcare system and not get us the healthcare that everyone in this state needs.
I go back to the three principles. It has to be universal, it has to be comprehensive, and it has to be affordable. And there are multiple ways that we can get there, including single payer. But I think single payer is a destination. It's not just a point where we can say we're going to do this immediately. The infrastructure that would be required to support a single payer system is something that we can build up over time. But the fact of the matter is right now we would need a waiver from the federal government in order to be able to achieve that. Other states that have tried single payer have not been successful at that. California, Vermont, others. So it's an admirable goal, but I think if we keep in mind the principles of universal, affordable, comprehensive coverage, then I think there's multiple ways that we can get there. The backbone of the system right now that we have is employer-provided health care plans. That is an important piece, but expansion of Medicaid eligibility, expansion of Medicare eligibility, I think all of those can lead us to a universal, comprehensive, affordable coverage.
So I brought the book right with me, of course. So I'm a big supporter of this idea. Look, single payer at its very core has to mean that you don't have an entity between the patient and the provider. And I think that under the Otto plan you do. And whatever you call that entity, if a provider has to deal with multiple payers, if a patient could come in and have a different sources of payment, it isn't single payer, and you don't get rid of all of the administrative waste. So if that entity bears risk, it's called insurance. So I think we need to get insurance companies out from between patients and providers. That's how we're going to get the waste out of the system and save a lot of money. Of course, it doesn't solve every single problem. It's not a be-all and end-all, but that's the basic thing that we have to get to.
Can I rebut that just because?
No.
Okay. Because I thought it wasn't debate, it was a forum.
That's okay. That's all good.
Yeah,
That's
right.
all good. I am a co-author as well on David Bly's bill, which is the House version of Senator Marty's bill, and I think I've been an author of that bill since I've been in the legislature. You know, I ran for office after I took care of my mom at the end of her life because she had to fight with the insurance companies to get her care, and it really made me angry, and people shouldn't have to go through that. In our very first term, I was the author of Healthcare Homes. And when we talk about delivery reform, this was a meaningful reform that I did with Senator Lori. And over 5 years' time, because we put the providers back in charge again, we saved the state more than $1 billion over 5 years, and we reduced disparities based on race because people got better outcomes and got better care. We know how to do this in the state of Minnesota. We have shown over and over again our ability to tackle tough issues, and this is one that we know how to do it. Becky Laurie is in the room right now. She was a part of the Gang of 7 that passed Minnesota Care and made it a nation-leading law. We know how to do this. We have lots of examples across the state of Minnesota. I have so much hope about our capacity on this front.
Thank you. This one is for Representative Thissen. What will you do to energize the DFL?
All right. Well, I think that, very good question. And I think that at the end of the day, it comes down to how we campaign and how we govern, which is governing together. We need to govern with people again instead of governing for them. You know, when we passed marriage equality, that was one of the most powerful moments that I've had in my legislative career, being able to gavel down the passage of that bill. And it was because, first of all, I looked out among the representatives, and I knew people had taken votes that they could lose their election over. And we don't have that kind of political courage anymore in this state, and we need to get back to that, and that's the kind of leadership that I think I've brought to the legislature and want to bring to the governor's office. But more importantly, I knew behind the chamber doors there were thousands of people in the Capitol who actually made it happen. We need to get back to that kind of politics where we are engaging with people and taking the energy on the ground in our communities across the state of Minnesota and bringing that down to the Capitol. That's the kind of leadership I've demonstrated and delivered on as in my role in the legislature, and that's the kind of leadership I want to deliver on when I'm the next governor.
Thank you. Paul Wellstone always said, politics has to be about the improvement of people's lives. And when our politics is about that, we energize people. When we don't run from our records, when we are not trying to dumb down our politics, when we're not trying to give people Republican light, then we engage people. We energize them. When we talk about their real life challenges and problems and how we can solve them, we enliven the party. We fire people up. We fire up the base. You've got to start with the people that have brought you to the dance. You've got to start with the fact that the people that believe in progressive DFL politics are hungry for people that are going to look you in the eye, tell you what you stand for, and tell you what you're going to do for them. That was what Paul did better than anybody. And when we do that, when we're honest about our values, we fire up the base, we'll get people out. It also helps to make sure that we're feeding them and providing them beer after a door knock, but that's a secondary part of that.
So, well, I am running because I think that in order to fire up the DFL, in order to fire up Minnesotans, we have to be bold and we have to be clear about who we're for. Because too often as DFLers, we say we're for ordinary people, but then when we get power, we use it to help the big shots and the insiders. And then people don't believe us anymore. And so we saw what Bernie Sanders did. He really fired up a lot of people, some who weren't even Democrats, and they came into the process because of him, because he was really speaking to what was really going on in their lives. And I think that's what we need to do. Secondarily, we have to answer the Republicans when they do their blah, 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 and it's all baloney. We need to answer, and that's something that I have done all the time and will continue to do.
I think we have to give Minnesotans a reason to vote for us again. I think this last election was too much about two people and not nearly enough about us and our future. And when I think about what I see happening in Minnesota's government right now, it's the very same thing. Spending 2 years of time in a session talking about how to win the next election and not talking about Minnesota and Minnesotans' futures. And when we talk about the things that matter to people's lives and we bring that into our campaign instead of sterile, message-tested talking points, Minnesotans engage with us. It's time for us, Democrats, to stand up for an honest, progressive vision that is about Minnesotans and about their future. And when we do that, when we put us back in our politics, and I've seen it all over, because I don't think there's anyone up here who's done more door knocking or spent more time in their car or on their feet talking with Minnesotans at their doors, in their kitchens, and in their garages. Minnesotans are optimistic and hopeful people, and we need to deliver that same optimism and hopefulness about our future, and when we do that, we liven things up.
I've run and won statewide 3 times, and sometimes people kind of, they think about the state auditor's race and how passionate Minnesotans get about the state auditor's race, because I'm so passionate about the work that I do on your behalf to make sure we have good government in the state of Minnesota. We're known for good government, actually internationally. What I've done is I'm putting together a strong statewide vision called Renew Minnesota, and I am working to solve real-world problems that we cannot do on our own. Someone said single-payer health care, and it is truly single-payer. There's going to be one fund, and that there are these problems that we're not able to solve on our own. I can't fix a health care system on my own, and I don't think any of you have had any luck with it either. It's something that government must and should do and step into. And that what I've done is I've created an agenda that all Minnesotans can see themselves in. That's really, really important. Whether you live in a rural area, an urban area, an ex-urban area, suburban area. And so I've worked hard to craft an agenda that will excite people and that they will go out and work hard to make sure that we win.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to have young people here. That gave me a quick segue into a very brief segment that before we do our closing statements, I want to talk to this audience, because it's great that you showed up. It's great that these people showed up. But ultimately, the responsibility for our democracy is ours. And so if you have a mirror, maybe you should get it out and look in it right now. And if you don't have a mirror, maybe you should look at your neighbor and realize that that's where real change is going to come from. And these candidates have shown up to talk to you, to pour their hearts into their campaigns, but ultimately it's up to Minnesotans. And part of what we have to do next is we have to understand the system that allows us to pick the right candidate for running for governor next year. So I don't know how many of you have ever been to a caucus, but these people happen to be DFLers. They're progressive candidates, and they're looking for support to make it through a caucus system, and our caucuses are February 6th. That means that you're going to have to give up a whole evening. You're going to have to go and try to figure out the intricacies of a DFL rule system there. But truthfully, you can change the rules when you show up. It's a little secret not very many people know. But there's a lot of organizations here that are going to be doing caucus trainings, and there's a lot of other organizations that you can turn to understand how to go to this and actually be an important part of a system. Because waiting until Election Day, after all of the candidates have already been picked for you, is not the way to do this. The way to do this is to jump in with both feet right now. Right now is the critical time. So put February 6th on your calendar and plan to show up. And then when you do, plan to run to be a delegate for somebody that you love, because having somebody that you love as leader of this state would be great, wouldn't it? And when you decide to run and support somebody you love, that means you're going to have to give up 1, maybe 2 more full days going to local conventions where you're going to have to run again in order to go to the state as a delegate. It sounds complicated. It's not, because you know who's going to be there? Your neighbors, the person next to you that you just looked at. It's not scary. It's a social event. And it's an important event, probably the most important social event you can decide to be a part of. And so this is a great first step, learning more about your candidates. Another really good step would be talking to your neighbors and finding out that they're interested in doing this too, but they've never done it either. And then finding out which of the organizations that are in your locality that you could go and take away some of the mystery and some of the fear of going to your DFL caucus, because it's an important thing to do. And they can't build the DFL back up by themselves. It takes everybody who cares about where our state is going. And trust me, this next election, whoever is governor is going to be in charge of redistricting, all sorts of things that will last forever and that are really important and nobody pays enough attention to. So that's my plea to you. Go February 6th. Decide to spend an evening. Is 2.5 days out of your time worth a state that you want to live in? I would hope so. So with that, first I want to thank all of the candidates and all of the audience that showed up tonight. It was a real pleasure to have you here. Keep me on track. I got off track a lot, but that was great to have you. We now have closing statements. The closing statements will be 90 seconds each. Feel free to clap afterwards. I might cut you off if I need to, but this is the time to show your appreciation for the people that showed up here. The order of this will be Otto, Liebling, Thissen, Murphy, and Coleman. So we're going to start with Auditor Otto, and you have 90 seconds for your closing statements.
All right. Well, thank you so very much for your patience this evening, for coming, for listening, for considering. I'm Rebecca Otto, the State Auditor, running for governor for 2018. And, you know, I've lived my values. My husband and I designed and built a renewable energy home decades ago. We've used it for a classroom. I know many of you have been through it or been to it. We drive electric vehicles. I work really hard to live my values because we understood climate change was real a long time ago. I come from a small business background. My husband and I started and founded a small business. I think that's really important for Governor, understanding the importance of attracting the innovators and the homegrowns in our state because they are a big part of our economy. You know, I wanted to give back in a meaningful way. I got a master's of education and I taught in our public schools. And I also served on a school board and chaired a levy. Education is one of the most important things that we do as a state, and we must do better. And state budget, you know, we may be going into a deficit, but I'll tell you, my focus is all bread and butter. It's the economy. When our economy is ticking and it's strong, we can invest in those things that we hold dear. And so my agenda is all about making sure we have a strong economy that's ticking along. And my Health in Minnesota plan, my Minnesota Power Plan, and my 1552 are all really important towards that. My website is RebeccaOtto.com. I invite you to please take a look at it. I've got all details on my policies. I'm here tonight to ask for your support. I have a grassroots, people-powered campaign. I cannot do it on my own. I would love your support, and I want to thank you.
Representative Liebling is next.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a great pleasure to be here tonight. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Minnesota, and my dad was a photographer. He used to take me around the state, and he photographed the people of Minnesota. And he taught me that the people of Minnesota, the ordinary workaday people, the people who get up every day and do what they have to do, those are really the heroes in life. The single mom who struggles along to take care of her kids even though she's not making enough money, the older person who just tries to keep going a few more years because they need some more money to live on, those are the heroes of Minnesota. Those are the people that we really have to be about and keep in mind. And I'm running because I believe that as Democrats, we need to be bold. We need to put a bold vision for people and tell them that we're really for them, not for the big shots and the insiders. And sometimes as Democrats, we compromise too soon. Instead of putting out a bold vision, we put out a compromise vision. We say, we can wait 5 years to get this done. Well, no, we need to say, we need to do this now. And if we need to compromise, okay, compromise does happen in politics. And I know because I've been married 32 years, so I do know how to compromise. And in closing, just let me tell you, Tina Liebling, L-I-E-B-L-I-N-G, and Tina stands for There Is No Alternative. So if you want a bold progressive, there is no alternative. Thank you.
Representative Thissen.
Yeah, well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I really do appreciate the chance to speak with all of you. To me, this comes down to two things. We need to win in 2018, and we need to elect someone that can do the job. And I submit to you that one of the strengths I bring to this campaign is the ability to unify this party and this state. I've built statewide winning coalitions, both electorally and winning legislative victories, really, really important legislative victories. And I think that that is really important, and I have the credibility to go out to the people of Minnesota and say we can achieve great things because I've been there in the legislature and I've done it over and over and over again. And I think that that's really important. And I also tells you what I can do if I'm going to be elected your next governor, which is we will actually not just talk about stuff, but we will get it done. At the end of the day, what this comes down to is we have to take on the power dynamics. If we talk about racial disparities, if we talk about economic insecurity, if we talk about the rural-urban divide, at the end of the day, all of those problems exist because there's too much power concentrated in too few hands, and we need a governor that's going to stand up and speak against that. And I've done that in my legislative career, and I will continue to do that as the next governor. The last thing I just want to say, and I thank you for talking about the importance of this process, because I will honor the DFL endorsement. No individual can win this race on their own. It's not about any individual. We need to come together as a party, and by honoring the DFL endorsement, we are able to build the energy that you talked about. We can't do it alone. We have to do it together, and I think that that's really important. I ask for your support, and I thank you for listening tonight.
Representative Murphy?
This has been an awesome evening, and I'm really grateful that you're here and I'm with you. I'm running for governor because I believe in a kind of politics that improves people's lives, and when we use that together, we can build a bright future for everybody in the state of Minnesota. And when I think about that, it of course includes strong public schools, single-payer health care, and jobs that we can support our families with. We need to dig in on the hard issues of climate change and tackling racial disparities, and we need to recognize that the tools of our democracy, they are under assault, and if we lose them, we lose our capacity to build that bright future that is ours. I had breakfast in Aurora, Minnesota with a group of women who call themselves the walkie-talkies because they walk to breakfast and then they eat and talk together. And when we got done with breakfast, and they grilled me pretty good there, we walked up and down the streets of Aurora. It is a mining town without a mine, and those women were determined. They said, no one's going to solve our community's problems but us. It is up to us. And I have watched over my years of service in Minnesota, Minnesotans working very hard every single day to support their families and to build their communities. And you should expect that same hard work, that same ambition from your government and from your governor. And when I am elected to be the next governor of the state of Minnesota, you will see that in me every single day. I am Irish and I'm a nurse. I'm calm in a crisis, but I am a fighter. And when elected, I'm going to fight every single day for the people of Minnesota. I hope to earn your support, your vote, and your trust. Thank you very, very much.
Mayor Coleman.
Well, not to play into stereotypes, but I just realized, why is it that the two Irish people are from St. Paul? I think that
Why is there a Jew in between?
I don't know. You know, it's all good. But
I'm a quarter Irish.
All right, well, keep your quarter down there. Look, my time is waning. Look at folks, as I said at the beginning, Minnesota needs a governor who's a champion for the progressive values that have made this state the wonderful place it is to live, to work, to raise a family. I've been that progressive champion as mayor for the last 12 years. You don't have to wonder how I'm going to govern as the governor of the state of Minnesota. Look at my record and look at what we have accomplished together. We built one of the largest out-of-school time networks to extend the learning day for our children and make sure they had the resources that they need to be successful. We built a great transit system, but we made sure that it actually served transit-dependent people, and we changed federal law in order to get that done. We became a leader on issues like climate change. We've trained every employee in the city of St. Paul on implicit bias and on racial equity to make sure that they were serving everyone. That's the work agenda that we need to bring across the state of Minnesota. That's how we're going to win. We need a progressive champion, and we know that the stakes are high. Every election is important, but we know what will happen if we don't hold on to the governor's office in the state of Minnesota. We've seen the Republican vision. We've seen what it's done in other states, and we saw what they did this last legislative session. We need to hold on to this office. We need to win, and we need to be true to our progressive values, because that is what has made Minnesota a great state, and that is what will continue to make Minnesota a wonderful place to call home. Thank you so much.
Before we're done for the evening, I want to thank again Representative Flanagan for coming. We were disappointed that Congressman Walz had to be in Washington, D.C. We're honored that you came and attended this, and I want to remind the audience that we're hoping the candidates will stay around until about 9:20 or 9:25 at the tables. If you have questions from tonight, you should go and talk to them more. I will say that we have Senator Marty's book for sale at the St. Croix Valley Women's Alliance. If you're interested in single-payer health care, it's a very interesting read. And we hope that you do all take away from this more information, a passion for going forward, and make sure that you do your part in ensuring that Minnesota is where we want it to be in the next 4 years. So thank you again to all the sponsors. Thank you very much to all of the candidates. It's been a great evening. We need to be out of the building by 9:30. There will be people ushering you out if you're still milling around. Thank you so much for coming.
Don't mill around.
I learned that whole thing.
I'm actually not sure. So my mom's sisters kind of had.
Oh, I really had Tim, but that's.
So then if we do that, everything's up in the air.
That could be it. I don't know.